Yeah. Okay. All right. Just making sure you knew.
I have a karaoke competition in the background.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jennifer Lezak, Coordinator of Special Projects with the Adult Services Department, and on behalf of everyone at the Chicago Public Library, welcome. Before we begin tonight's program, please welcome my colleague, Daylily Alvarez, representing CPL's Native American Heritage Committee, to read our land acknowledgement. Daylily?
Greetings. Thank you for joining us today. On behalf of the Chicago Public Library and the Native American Heritage Committee of the Chicago Public Library, we would like to start today's program with a land acknowledgement. The Chicago Public Library is located on traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox, also call this area home. The region has long been a center for Indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. Today, one of the largest urban American Indian communities in the United States resides in Chicago. Members of this community continue to contribute to the life of the city and to celebrate their heritage, practice traditions, and care for the land and waterways. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Daylily, and thanks to all of the CPL staff serving on this year's Native American Heritage Committee for their help in making tonight's program possible. Check out our website for additional programs presented in honor of Native American Heritage Month. Tonight's program is part of the 2020 One Book, One Chicago season, exploring the theme Beyond Borders, and the book Exit West by Mohsen Hamid. For more information on other virtual programs, including book discussions, author events, workshops, and more, visit onebookonechicago.org. Thanks to the Chicago Public Library Foundation, Bank of America, Union Pacific, and United Airlines for their support in making this season of One Book, One Chicago possible. During tonight's program, we'll be monitoring the chat for questions from the audience for our Q&A following the conversation, so please feel free to ask one at any time in the chat. Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome author, professor, and activist Dr. Anton Treuer to speak to his unique perspective on Indigenous land, language, and identity as it relates to the broader experience of being and becoming American. Dr. Treuer's equity, education, and cultural work has put him on a path of service around the region, the nation, and the world. He is Professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University and author of 19 books, including The Assassination of Hole in the Day, Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask, Atlas of Indian Nations, Warrior Nation, and the Indian Wars. Of course, you can check out these books at Chicago Public Library. He has sat on many organizational boards and has received more than 40 prestigious awards and fellowships, including ones from the American Philosophical Society, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Bush Foundation, and the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. He is on the governing board for the Minnesota State Historical Society, and in 2018, he was named Guardian of Culture and Lifeways and recipient of the Pathfinder Award by the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. We're so pleased to have him here tonight. Again, following his presentation, we'll have a chance to ask our guests questions, so please leave your questions in the chat, which we'll be monitoring. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Anton Treuer to the CPL virtual stage.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Koe maji tayan nui Ojibwe majines mietago windamunugug awian wagosh indigu minawa migizi and dodem. Anyway, wasawadosh konigan wenja bayan kazagasquaji mekag. I was just giving you a brief introduction in my Ojibwe language to tell you that my native name is Wagosh, which means fox. I'm from the Eagle clan, and I come from Leech Lake, which is in northern Minnesota. I'm really excited to have a conversation with you all tonight, and I look forward to your questions and connecting with you directly when we get to the Q&A segment. Before I do, I just wanted to say a few words about what's going on in Indigenous communities and the importance of language, culture, and even connection to place, which I think is an experience that Native people have it's rather distinct within the broader American experience. And even addressing you in Ojibwe for a few seconds, I usually do this simply because people smarter, older, and wiser than me say, when you go somewhere new, then follow our protocol and tell them your native name, clan, and where you're from. And so in doing that, oftentimes it's strange to me that while my language is one of the many Indigenous languages here in America, people often look at it like, what foreign language is he speaking? And I think I'm just about to the point now where I have like the president and deans at my university convinced that if somebody calls and asks for the Department of Foreign Languages to send them to the English department. But it is a work in process to shift consciousness. I'm going to share a few slides with you here. And one of the first ones that you're going to see is an image of Tom Stillday. So you can go ahead and flip to the next one there. And he was actually the first person named chaplain for the Minnesota State Senate who wasn't from one of the Abrahamic religions of the world. So that was him with his pipe, opening up the state Senate. He had a great sense of humor too, because he said, "I'm praying for politicians. Boy, do they need it." And I always thought that was pretty hilarious, but also quite prescient looking at what we've been going on in our political climate these days. But one time we had him at the university here in northern Minnesota, where I asked him to give a graduation banquet speech. And although he was notoriously long-winded, I told him, you keep it short, tell a couple of jokes, focus on the students. And he said, okay. And he got up and he spoke for about an hour and a half. And it was all in Ojibwe. There wasn't a word of English until he was all done, when he said, "All you people who study Indians, study that." And he went and sat down. So I was highly entertained, but he had a lot of good points. Like, most of the books written about Native people have been written by non-Native people who haven't spent much time in a Native place or speaking to Native people. So how are you going to get Native perspectives through that? And the same could be said for, educational interventions, the suicide prevention plan, the economic development plan that someone cooks up outside of our communities and then comes to us to get some buy-in after it's fully baked. Usually such efforts fail pretty terribly. You can go ahead and flip to the next slide. So all of us as human beings obviously have ancestors. And I think one of the things that happens with non-Indigenous folks in America is there is a process, whether it was voluntary, involuntary, or under some kind of duress, there was a process of disconnecting from mother land. And for many people, of disconnecting from mother tongue, and in varying degrees from mother culture, to come here, to accept a degree of assimilation, to get a piece of sweet American apple pie. And for Native people, it's different. I think most Americans probably know their parents and grandparents and maybe the names of their great-grandparents, and beyond that might not know their names or even where they're buried. My relatives have been buried in the same place longer than America's been a country, and it feels different. And the connection to the ancestral line feels and plays differently. On the left-hand side of your screen there with this very ancient face is John Smith, no connection to the one from Pocahontas legend, but he was born in Minnesota in the 1700s before any white settlement. And he had a very long life. he passed away in Minnesota in the 1900s when they're sending people off to World War I. And just think about the incredible changes he must have seen during his lifetime. On the other side of the screen is another kind of famous figure in the Ojibwe world, although anyone else might know about, named Wabujig or Whitefisher. And I never really had the tools to talk about this when I was going to school, but it bothered me more as I got older that I could go to school for 13 years in a row, so I could learn whatever was important that I would need to know to be successful in the world, but none of it had anything to do with me. And from kind people, good-hearted people who really wanted to see me succeed, my educators, the message became not through mean or overt acts of racism, but simply through absent narratives, that you and yours just aren't important, aren't relevant, don't matter. And in the educational world, you know, this has big ramifications. I think anyone who feels perhaps assaulted is going to have predictable responses: fight, flight, freeze. And often the education professionals are scratching their heads. How come we have truancy issues with these Native kids? Or how come we have discipline issues? You know, and how come they seem spaced out, zoned out, and they're not really engaging with the teacher? And all of those are perfect examples of, you know, flight, fight, and freeze. You can go ahead and flip to the next one. So I'll give you just a minute or two on me, not because that's the center of this discussion, but simply because none of us see the world the way that it is. We all see the world the way we are, and we're all different. So here are pictures of my folks. They both passed away over the past few years, but I was really, really lucky in many different ways to have the kind of relationship I did with both of them. My father wasn't Native at all. He was actually an Austrian Jewish immigrant, a Holocaust survivor. He spoke nothing but German the first 13 years of his life. He has an amazing story of his own. He, both his parents, and 2 cousins made it out. Everyone else was killed in concentration camps and so forth during the Nazi Holocaust. And I'll give you the short version of the story to kind of set up tonight's talk, but I'm happy to field more questions about him and his experience, and we get to questions and answers too. And the short version is, eventually he made his way to Minnesota, met my mom, and here I am. My mom grew up in a little village called Bena in the heart of the Leech Lake Reservation, population 400. Don't blink when you're driving by or you might miss it, even though it's the epicenter of the universe. But I think for her, harvesting wild rice, fishing, you know, snaring rabbits and things like that was less a cool cultural pastime and more a necessary means of survival. She had a pretty visceral experience with poverty. You can go ahead and flip to the next slide. As my parents were getting started, I guess you could say my dad was hitting a restart button and my mom was trying to find a pathway out of poverty. And there were kind of humble beginnings. So my kids can't even imagine some of this, but you know, we had an outhouse, we had a kerosene lantern, there wasn't electricity or running water, you know, a little hand pump. We washed up in the creek in the summer. In the winter, it was enamel wash basins by a wood barrel stove. And you can go ahead and flip to the next one. But I saw big changes throughout my upbringing. By the time I hit middle school, my mother had become the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota, built a nice house, and the economic profile for our family changed quite a bit. And to me, it revealed the power of an education. It's undeniable. And I think for most, you know, immigrants, for people who've experienced any kind of oppression or disadvantage, while education does not guarantee success and prosperity, it's a lever that improves your chances. And all the data sets and everything support that. I do kind of follow the George Carlin line. We call it the American dream because you got to be asleep to believe it. The American dream mythology, it's kind of like half true. And the true stuff is what I saw my parents do and what I think many immigrants have done. and at the same time only half true, because there are barriers out there and they are not equitably distributed. In fact, they are predictably distributed along fault lines of gender and race and so forth to provide unearned advantage or disadvantage to some. You can flip. So that's my family. I've got 9 kids. It is never dull. This is why I snuck into my office tonight for the talk, because during supper time, music lessons, you know, there's all kinds of chaos going on. And while you might be greatly entertained, it'd be pretty hard to follow what I'm doing. So I'm now at the point where like half of my kids are out the door. Got a couple grandkids. My wife's in the middle of the pile there. She's from the Swedish American tribe. So someone is getting along out there. And I can fill you full of crazy kids stories too, which is actually a great pleasure for me. So feel free to ask about that. You can flip to the next one. The view off the front deck for my house, I kind of feel like Shrek. That's my swamp. But among the things that my parents did is, when my folks were getting started, my dad had put in a bid on a piece of tax forfeited property. It was sealed bids. So he got a letter back saying, yours was the only bid we received, but it's not enough money to cover the delinquent taxes. Can you find a couple $100 extra, which he borrowed, and got a pretty big piece of property for relatively little money. At one point, it was a virgin white pine forest, but it had been clear cut and it was all farm fields when he got it. So he started planting trees. And in fact, he planted all of the trees in this picture right here. It completely transformed the landscape and the ecosystem. And that was one dude with a child labor force, but it was incredible to me. It's still incredible to me how much changed from that one human being's effort. And to me, when we look at the big problems that we are asking our children to inherit, like climate change, race relations, you know, and things like that, I think a lot of us look at those things and think, there's not much I can do about that. I'll be a decent human being. I'll tell my kids to be decent human beings, and I hope it's enough. But it's never quite enough. All that's necessary for evil to triumph is good people to do nothing or too little. But it's not like we got to take this mountain of problems that humans have been making for thousands of years and just move that whole mountain right now. It's more like we need to keep planting the seeds, and it can transform the landscape and the entire ecosystem. And that's what we do in education. That's what we do with literature and books and even events like this. We are constantly planting seeds and nurturing them and helping them grow. And it really can transform everything. Go ahead and flip. Yeah, so I kind of have one foot in an ivory tower and one in a wigwam. So my family does a lot of stuff like this. We harvest wild rice, as we're doing in this picture. We make maple syrup and sugar. We hunt, we fish. My kids probably produce about $10,000 worth of food every year. Of course, they eat it all and a whole bunch more, so rich in all the ways that matter the most. But to me, those kind of activities, to some degree, keep us more recognizable to our ancestors and generate self-esteem and a sense of self-assuredness in my children that I think pays huge dividends with anything they set their minds to. Plus, it's fun and it's healthy. And Monsanto hasn't gotten their hands on wild rice just yet, even though they're probably trying. So there are a lot of different reasons why we do these sorts of activities. Of course, you heard my kind of professional resume too. I publish books and travel around and give talks, things like that. So it's been a great perspective builder. Go ahead and flip to the next one. So if I held up my finger like this and I said, what is this? I could start a fight unless we clarified in what language, because in the language of body parts, well, that is a finger. But in the language of numbers, that's a 1. And in the language of space, well, that's up. So who's right? And they're all right. It's a matter of language. It's a matter of context and understanding. And here's what happens when we want to talk about something important like race relations in America. All too often, someone gets up there and says, this is a finger, it's not an elbow, it's not a toe. The rest of you, shh. and someone's listening going, that's a 1, not a 2, not a 3. See, they just don't understand. And we totally miss each other. So it's really powerful when we can see this as a 1 and a finger and up and all the other many things that it is. In fact, in some cultures, it's almost like putting up your middle finger. It can be very insulting. So how helpful to know that before you enter that cultural space. And that's what it means to have multiple perspectives. And when you get good at it, to be multicultural. And it's why it's so important to take everyone we want to give a good talking to right now and give them a good listening to. Go ahead, you can flip again. So I wanted to share just a couple things about identity. I think as human beings, we are all changing, not just as individuals, but as cultures all the time. We're like, the human experience is like, we're like water rushing down a mountain. We just often follow the gorges and paths of least resistance. Once in a while, there's an event or even a person who stands in the middle of the rushing torrent and kind of redirects the flow to another channel, but it's always changing. And I've never met an elder from any culture who did not shake his or her head and go, kids these days. Because there's always this tension about cultural change and cultural continuity. And frankly, they're both positive, right? Like some kinds of change, maybe innovations in healthcare, most people would agree, are quite positive. But some other kinds of change, like maybe the loss of a language, very different. And humans are complex. We are all, our identities are deeply informed by many different things. It's partially about our race. Like if I said for a white guy like me, it's really hard to understand. People are like, wait, what? Even though I'm just as white as I am native, I just happen to show up brown and braids, or today it's a man bun, and so it's contextual. Race is partially about color, and there's no way around that. It's also partially about culture. There's a big difference between a Black Dominican who speaks Spanish, a Black Haitian who speaks French Creole, and an African American who speaks English. They might all get racially profiled the same way, but their cultural experience is different. And also consciousness, how we see ourselves. And this is something that often happens within immigrant communities, where the first generation of people who come to America often have a very strong grounding in heritage, language, culture, and so forth, and then try to bequeath that to their children. But one of the biggest factors that influences the development of a child's language is actually not the language of the parents. It's not even the language of the school. It's the language of their peers. And so we become who we hang out with. And so oftentimes after a couple of generations, immigrant families find it a big challenge to maintain the continuity of that heritage language. And that does happen within the native space too. And I wanted to talk a bit about language and culture as we go deeper into the talk today. But we're influenced by place. I think for me, one of the reasons I keep turning down other job offers, even though I'm kind of a hotshot academic and could take a job in a number of places, is because I can step out the door to my house and there's my father's forest. And all the grandparents for my kids are within 10 minutes of the front door. And I'm also somebody who's kind of a servant to my community. I officiate at funerals and other kinds of Ojibwe ceremonies. And I really couldn't do that if I was separated from that community. So there are a lot of reasons why that connection to place is so important. And it's really one of the defining attributes of indigeneity. Like we are all indigenous to somewhere. But as we get disconnected from, our original place, then as a marker of identity, it becomes less significant. And in fact, as Americans, like we will tell people, if you get a job and the job's in California, move to California, become Californian. And we celebrate our freedom to have a somewhat malleable identity. For me as a Native person, I feel more of a tether to place. But that tether is also liberating at the same time, and it's empowering. And I feel like I'm stepping in the footsteps of my ancestors just when I'm walking in the woods, or when I'm speaking their language, or officiating at these kinds of ceremonies. And as you can see in this picture, I get to wear lots of different kinds of clothes. So here I am with one of my kids gearing up for powwow. And I am someone who does a lot of code switching, right? Like I do academic English really well, and I do my Ojibwe really well. And I can kind of switch back and forth. What James Baldwin would sometimes talk about, like there's this dual consciousness where we're in our affinity space, and then we're in mainstream American space, and we can code switch back and forth, but it can be confusing as we swim in these other waters that change us. There are many other markers of identity too. Customs, culture, ancestor connection. Economy is not just money, but where do we get our food? Is it from the lake? Is it from the woods? Is it from the grocery store? Education is also a cultural indoctrination. And even for Native people, there are often distinct political systems, Native nations, where citizenship is something that's really complex and so forth. And for Native people and immigrants and so forth, we have some shared experiences simply in that most of these attributes of identity are under some kind of pressure. They're stressed. Over half the Native population lives off reservation. And in fact, places like Chicago were relocation destinations where lots of Native people were moved from reservations around the Great Lakes and sometimes from across the country. And the same was true where Milwaukee and Minneapolis and Detroit were also relocation destinations as they tried to convince Native people to leave their communities and come to the big city. A really distinct experience that is still very much felt today. You can go ahead and flip. I think the other message from that is we often say in America that we're all immigrants, but for some of us, we're not. And so we have some shared experience and even some of the same shared tensions, but also experience America and even things like education very differently. I think, for Black Americans, for example, education is often seen as an opportunity that for a long time was unfairly denied. And for Native people, oftentimes education is seen as a tool that was used to forcibly assimilate Native people into the American mainstream. And so while I'm somebody who's an educator and believes very strongly in its power, at the same time, I'm very aware that it's a double-edged sword that has sometimes been part of the oppression apparatus for us. And at the same time, when we want to see change in the world, we have to be the change and we have to make the change. And things like fairness are not given. They have to be orchestrated by us. And that's any kind of fairness we want to orchestrate. So you can go ahead and flip. Most of the pictures in my PowerPoint are pictures of my kids out there harvesting wild rice and doing stuff like that. One of my more recent books, The Language Warrior's Manifesto, How to Keep Our Languages Alive No Matter the Odds, is really probably one of my more personal books where I, in part, share my narrative around language and culture reclamation, and also a collective narrative as we are seeking to do this for an entire group of people. My tribe, the Ojibwe, are a pretty big tribe. We're actually just as big as the Cherokee, 250,000 of us. We just happen to be spread across Canada and the United States, several states in America, and a number of Canadian provinces. And so we're big, and we're also geographically spread out. And as a result, we're not always on everyone's radar screen the way that some of the other tribes that get a lot of Hollywood attention have been. You can go ahead and flip again. So I wanted to share a few thoughts about the importance of Indigenous languages and cultures. And I'm hoping that for all of you, whatever your background or experience is, that you'll be able to relate this to your own. I can tell you, just in the many conversations I've had with my wife, who I mentioned is from the Swedish American tribe, there's basically just my joke way of saying, you know, she's a 5th generation Swedish American immigrant, Minnesota farm family. And, you know, for her, she often feels this kind of lament about a disconnection from her Nordic roots, place, language, culture, customs. While the first Lutheran church might be quite alive and well in northern Minnesota, the kind of village-based, communal, earth-focused indigeneity that was so central to the Nordic experience for so long, she's hungry for that and finds it very difficult to access. And then feels this, you know, juxtaposition to what I've been doing with our children in terms of their language and culture upbringing. And it elevates that sense for her. So we can talk about that a little bit too. You can go ahead and flip to the next slide. So obviously, to me, I guess, obviously, every language encapsulates a unique world view. It's so distinctive. I just wrote a few Ojibwe words on the slide here just to give you a sense. But one of the things that's kind of cool about the Ojibwe language is that the smallest meaningful parts of words, what we call morphemes, those are commonly known to everyday speakers of Ojibwe. And that means that when we're using a word for something, there's this kind of deeper meaning that's embedded in the word that's also being conveyed. So you kind of speak with two meanings. So, you know, good speakers of Ojibwe will often say, wow, when you tell a story in the language, it's like you're painting a picture, or the language lends itself to humor very differently. And here are just a couple examples. I'll just give you a couple of them. In the middle of the list there, this word Gichiaya'a is the word for elder, and it literally means great being. And then the next word there, Mindemuye, the word for a female elder, literally means one who holds things together and describes the role of the family matriarch. Now in English, we have words too, and they do have roots. You sometimes have to unpack, you know, the Germanic roots or the Latin ones or the Greek ones. Shoot, there's even 20 Ojibwe words in the English language, you know, totem, toboggan, and so forth. But in Ojibwe, it's a little different. So in English, we can say old woman, aged woman, elderly woman, hag, you know, but they tend to be value laden. And think about this, like a language reflects the values of a people and also shapes it. So how many elders do we have on the cover of Cosmo? And there's something that, you know, within the intersection of gender, within culture, in mainstream American culture, that I think is really troubling. Like the messaging we give young women is often that your primary value is in your youth and vibrancy and ability to attract a man. And that's part of your success, rather than in something intrinsic to yourself. And because we don't stay 20 forever, that there is this kind of torture that people go through in American culture, where they won't admit their age and want to get a Botox injection and a facelift and, you know, dye their hair so we can try to live up to this completely ridiculous pressure, right? And so in Ojibwe, you don't have to say things like respect your elders. It's kind of built right in with any word you could use. And it just reflects a broader cultural perspective. Like we even have, you know, cultural teachings and sayings in the Ojibwe world that say like, there are 4 seasons, you know, spring, summer, fall, winter. There are 4 seasons in life, you know, babies, young people, adults, and elders. There's even 4 seasons in love, you know, all these different things. And that we pray for people to like see all their seasons, to have a long, healthy, happy life. And There's even a blessing like, you know, a pegish ge bimadisi and binish gashketusiwan geabida shagome kawad miskomin. Like, I hope you can live so long that you'll no longer even be able to crush a raspberry between your gums. And that's something that someone should want, you know? Or like when a kid does something nice for an elder, right? Does some chores, hauls in some firewood. The elder might touch their head and touch the kid's head and say, Wabikwan bejikiminen. Like, I'm giving you a white hair. And it's like a way of saying, you'll get to be an elder too someday. You're going to do it one good deed at a time until you've earned a full white head, you know? And so these kind of cultural concepts are built right in. And the language is full of them. So when we get to Q&A, if you want to ask, like I have some other ones here, and happy to talk about any of these things, the importance of native names, clans, place names. There's so many different things, and unpacking that is really pretty revelatory about different Indigenous worldviews. Go ahead and flip. Yeah, so I kind of like this Harding Carter quote. You know, there are but two lasting bequests we can hope to give our children. The first of these is roots and the other wings. And a lot of times I think we tell our kids wings, right? Like finish high school, go to college, spread your wings, fly. But the importance of roots is also really critical. And frankly, there are lots of human beings who feel unrooted and like they're trying to figure out who they are. And I think, you know, some of the pressure to achieve and our focus on rugged individualism, which pays certain kinds of positive dividends, also has this unrooting effect. And so to me, I'm pretty attentive to the roots. Go ahead and flip to the next one. There are a lot of reasons why Indigenous languages matter. To me, it's partially about sovereignty. One of the things that defines a nation like France is having a land that is France and a language that is French. And a Frenchman can be French even if he's traveling in China because of his connection to those things. You can go ahead and flip again. And I might breeze through a few of these things just because I want to be mindful of the time, and I got all kinds of cool stuff I want to share with you. But we'll be able to take it deeper. And even when I'm totally done with the talk, I'll make sure you've got access to my website and contact information so we can keep in touch with one another. The United Nations has provided criteria for, you know, a people and a nation. And they include a living language, a living identifiable culture, and a sovereign land base. You can go ahead and flip again. To me, language is how we access the unique worldview of a people, but also their history and thoughts. And in a number of my publications and research, oftentimes things that have only been accessible by working within Indigenous languages are concepts of leadership, connections to place, and even getting access to stories. A lot of times oral histories have been dismissed, like if I whisper in Jennifer's ear and she whispers in someone else's and then to someone else, and by the time it comes out the other end, it's totally distorted. At the same time, oftentimes oral histories are not told by whispering in someone's ear. They're told in large groups. They're repeated tellings. They're often prompters if you deviate from stories. They're often kind of, like in the Ojibwe world, we had written kind of mnemonic devices on birch bark and things like that to maintain all of the substance to important stories and narrations. And even like with the Assassination of Hole in the Day, there was this event where one of the Ojibwe leaders, Hole in the Day, was threatening a fort in central Minnesota, and other Ojibwe people came and surrounded the fort and then faced out to protect it. And you could tell that much from the event from what the Army officer is writing in his journal. But if you wanted to know the interesting questions, like why would this group of Ojibways threaten the fort and this group want to defend it? No one had any idea. Until I talked to Melvin Eagle and was asking him, and he says, oh, I'll tell you. That was my grandfather who led the warriors over to the fort to surround it and protect it. And here's what I was told. And all of a sudden, there's all this really vital information that oftentimes people have been dismissive of. And it's one of the issues just in the academy broadly. Like when I was doing my graduate work, I actually had one of my advisors say, I don't know if you should study Ojibwe anything. And the reason is you're Ojibwe, so you might be biased. And I said, really? Is this coming from a white man who built his entire career by publishing 20 books about white men? But I had to fight that fight. You can flip. So with the Native experience in history, we have history. That doesn't mean we are history. 87% of American school districts don't teach anything about Native anything after 1900. But here we are. We are ancient and modern, all at the same time. We are thousands of years of documented human history still in the making. Go ahead and flip again. So there are a lot of barriers for keeping a language alive. We've got about, and you can go ahead and flip again, there are about 7,000 languages spoken in the world today. Over 2,000 are highly endangered. Like you can count the number of speakers on two hands. 2,000 languages are that endangered. And all that's necessary for most of these languages to die is for us just to do nothing. It's a big job to intervene and do something about them. Only about 100 of the world's languages are actively and widely taught at colleges and universities. Only 100. So while most people are aware that we are coming to a bottleneck in terms of like extinction of animal species and things like that, it's also happening with whole bodies of human knowledge and whole different ways of knowing and different ways of solving problems. You can go ahead and flip again. Yeah, and this is just some of that data on world languages. And we were over 500 languages in the US and Canada at the time of contact. We're down to maybe 130 now. 20 of those are spoken by children. 4 have so many speakers, they'll definitely be here 100 years from now, but it's scary what's going on. Go ahead and flip again. Yeah, this is just some more information on language loss, even in a region of Canada where some of the speaker rates are much higher. It's crazy what's going on. Go ahead and flip again. And we also in America segregate people. We keep our elders with the elders. We keep the kids with the kids. We keep the first graders with the first graders and the sixth graders with the sixth graders. And all of that interrupts, I think, our natural intergenerational transmission of knowledge. A lot of people just don't even know their grandparents' stories because we just don't spend that much time with them. All right, flip again. And a lot of languages are really struggling because there just aren't enough resources. There aren't enough books. There isn't enough material. It's pretty unlikely that most groups of humans are going to kind of go Amish, so to speak, trying to wall their language and culture off in, freeze it in time and segregate from the rest of the world. It's so hard. But if you're going to be modern and keep your language alive, then you need your cell phone speaking your language. You need your computer, your TV, the operating systems. You need the Xbox, all of these sort of things. And even in remote communities in Canada where everybody speaks a tribal language, as soon as they get electricity, there's some kind of satellite dish or what have you, and kids are watching SpongeBob in English, and they start to chit chat with each other in English. It's quite powerful. Go ahead and flip again. There's a great book on race relations called White Fragilities, written by Robin DiAngelo, and I'd highly recommend it. And among the hats I get to wear is I do a lot of racial equity and cultural competency kind of work and training with educators, police officers, social services, and so forth. And this is an important concept for understanding. But frankly, there's a sense that many Americans have about what's normal and what's valuable. And oftentimes people have this position that you need English to be successful. That if you want a job, if you want to succeed in school, it has to happen with English. And I disagree. I think there's, many wonderful things you can do with English, but there are many wonderful things, in fact, all of them that you could do in Chinese or in Ojibwe or any other language. And oftentimes, I think in our current political climate, many Americans are just terrified about our demographic shift and that it will erode the cultural power that has been unearned but given to white Americans, white English-speaking Americans, and that there is a pushback to preserve those things, which often makes it hard to keep marginalized languages and cultures alive. Go ahead and flip again. Yeah, a lot of people just aren't aware, aren't involved, aren't committed, even in Indigenous communities. People are worried about, like, let's keep the propane tanks full and let's deal with suicide prevention and substance abuse. And it almost seems like a luxury to do something on Indigenous languages. Although to me, all of us as human beings need healing. And what does healing look like to me? Learning Indigenous languages, learning about yourself, building positive self-esteem, connecting to one another. These things are really important. Like substance abuse, the opposite of substance abuse is not sobriety. The opposite of substance abuse is connection. When people are connected to one another in healthy ways, connected to their community in healthy ways, connected to themselves in healthy ways, then the drivers for things like substance abuse begin to evaporate. All right, go ahead and flip again. So I'll give you just a minute or two on some of my own experience with this, and you can go ahead and flip the slide one more time. My grandmother, who's still alive, she's in this picture here, her name's Luella, she's 97, and you know, she was brought to residential boarding schools, received harsh physical punishment for speaking Ojibwe, and there was a break in the intergenerational transmission of the language in our family. She's holding my youngest daughter, Luella, who's actually 9 years old now, who's been growing up, you know, in my home hearing a lot of Ojibwe and having a lot of exposure to her culture. But those things didn't just happen. We had to make those things happen. Go ahead and flip again. So I think, to the horror of my parents, I graduated from college and said, I'm coming home to walk the earth and learn about my language and culture. I'm not taking a job. That didn't last for too long, but the coming home part was pretty permanent. I ended up finding this guy, Archie Mose, who is a great first speaker of Ojibwe. In fact, his English was pretty clunky. He never really mastered English that well. And I stumbled across him looking for some help with some ceremonial things and ended up living on his couch for a long time and driving him around to ceremonies and things like that, which gave me kind of a more holistic immersion experience in Ojibwe language and culture. Today, I officiate the medicine dance that he used to officiate for many years. And we had quite a journey together. Go ahead and flip one more time. Yeah, there's so many experiences there. And so I won't cover everything you see in all of your pictures here, but I'll just give you the 20,000 foot view of my experience. You can go ahead and flip one more time and one more. So I'll just give you a taste of some of the things like in our cultural toolbox that I learned and that I've been doing with my kids, just to give a sense of how that can affect people with their identity development and so forth. But one of the things we're doing right now, it's hunting season. We hunt white-tailed deer and small game and things like that. And when somebody gets their first deer, we actually have a ceremony where, you know, there'll be a prayer and so forth. But instead of just eating and having a feast, the successful hunter is like offered a spoonful of the first bite of the meal, like the deer meat from the animal that was killed. And they have to refuse to eat it. And they push back the spoon and they say, no, I'm thinking about children who don't have enough to eat. Ah, okay, so put it back, take another spoon, we'll say their native name again. They have to say, no, I'm thinking about my elders who can't get out in the woods to hunt for themselves. Ah, okay, so put it back, I'll take another one. Offer it, say their name again. No, I'm thinking of my family, my community, people who came here today to support me. Ah, okay. put it back and offer again. And on the fourth bite, then they can eat. And then we'll tell them, you just changed your life. Up until today, you were what we call a dependent. In fact, you depended on all of us to provide all of your food. And there they are, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, everyone's gathered. And today, though, you're providing for all of us. And that's what it means to be an adult. And you'll always have this power now. You'll have it when you pick berries. You'll have it when you go hunting. You'll have it when you catch fish. You'll have it when you get a job. It's the power to gather resources. And when you have resources, you think about children who don't have enough and elders who can't get it for themselves and your family and your community. And then they have to take the rest of their kill like packaged up deer meat. They give it away, so they're impoverished but rich. And it's one thing to say like maybe Indigenous culture is more communal, and it's another thing to see how it works. So I have 9 kids and I've done a lot of experimenting on them. And I have to say this particular experiment is really powerful. But like I had a friend, he was maybe 60 and he was complaining, oh, my back, I can't get out in the woods to hunt. So one of my teenagers was listening to him, didn't say anything. He went out, he harvested a deer, he packaged it up, he brought it to the guy's house, filled up his freezer, gave him a tan deer hide. And that guy was like on the verge of tears. He said, I didn't know people remembered that. So again, the cultural practices reflect our values, but they also shape them. And it's a job raising kids. And it's hard to instill values that you want them to have in them just by preaching at them. But when you show them what that looks like and how that can function, it's really, really powerful. Go ahead and flip again. All right, and one more time. I just want to share a couple of really cool things that are happening in Indigenous communities around this collectively. So my experience is not isolated. There are a number of really inspiring stories about Indigenous communities that have said, you know what, our cultures and our languages really matter. And so one of them is actually in Hawaii. There, they've actually went, at the lowest point, there were only 1,000 speakers of Hawaiian left on planet Earth. Today, there are about 23,000 speakers. Over 3,000 have learned it as their first language in the home now, tripling the population of first speakers and multiplying 23-fold the population of speakers. It didn't happen by accident. There are 22 Hawaiian medium schools where that's the language of instruction. And there's a huge array of resource development, books, computer programs, all kinds of things. And it's still a struggle, but it is really inspiring. It's also inspiring simply what's happening with regard to their educational achievement. One of the great ironies that's really puzzling people in mainstream education is that when these kids in these Hawaiian schools are learning in Hawaiian all day, every day, they're doing better in English and in mathematics than if they were taught in English all day, every day. Go ahead and flip one more time. So this is Rose Tainter saying, you know what? We want one of those immersion schools like those Hawaiians got. We want it for Ojibwe right here. And she was from Red Lake, Minnesota, but married a guy in Lacoudere, Wisconsin, and the kind of Hayward Lakes area. So some of your, Al Capones and stuff used to hide out there back in the day. But it's remarkable. I've done a lot of work with Waduko Dotting, team building and assessments on their staff and so forth. And I could tell you stories all night long about the inspiring things I've seen happen there. The Obamas came out to meet the kids at the school because for the first 15 years of operation, they had a 100% pass rate on state mandated tests in English, even though they were learning in Ojibwe all day, every day. Now, if somebody's figuring this stuff out at a time when about half of the students of color are underperforming in their state mandated tests in English and math, then holy crap, we should pay more attention to that. And what it says is when people do get to learn about themselves, when we are tuning into the positive identity development of whoever's coming through the door to the room at the school, then we're seeing the impacts. Go ahead, you can flip again. There are many other examples where this is happening. We've had some grassroots things happening too. This is a crazy white guy in my hometown in Bemidji who said, you know, when you go to Hawaii, everybody knows what aloha means. When they come here, they should know what buju, anin, and miigwech mean, and campaign for bilingual signage. Now it's actually on the hospitals, all the public schools, the regional event center, even the police cars have "to protect and serve" written out in Ojibwe. You can go ahead and flip again. And so we've been hustling and working hard, building all kinds of cool resources. And I'll kind of breeze through these next few slides just to kind of get to your questions and answers shortly. Go ahead and flip. So there's an online talking dictionary for Ojibwe now. Go ahead and flip again. We've been doing lexical expansion, so we can talk about and teach about anything and everything from algebraic formulas to the Bill of Rights to, you know, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, whatever it is. Go ahead and flip again. And one more time. Yeah, we've been developing literary traditions for what was formerly an oral language. The goal is to have over 5,000 books loaded in an accelerated reader program tagged by grade level, you know, and it's an emerging effort for us. But a lot of cool work's happening. Go ahead and flip again. If you're interested more in what's going on in the Ojibwe language revitalization world, there's a free video. This is an Emmy Award-winning video through Twin Cities Public Television. You could either Google the name First Speakers or just look at tpt.org and be able to find that. Go ahead and flip again. We have now, like in Mille Lacs, this is a group of elders that we're working with, and we have a young reader series of books that we're developing, and we're doing Rosetta Stone for Ojibwe. It's a major undertaking, but it's really exciting. We'll be able to catch anybody anywhere they are by pushing to them through an app on their phone so they can learn the language. Go ahead and flip again. All right, go ahead and flip one more time. That's the young reader version of my new book. Will be coming out here in a couple of months. And one more time. So I like the Margaret Mead quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Go ahead and flip one more. I also like, this is an old Mexican proverb, but one of my elders, Anna Gibbs, was paraphrasing it, speaking to me, and she said, every time they tried to bury us, they didn't realize that we were the seeds. Go ahead one more time. I think my mom got a lot of questions. Like I come from a pretty resi res, like meaning everybody knows somebody who burned up in a house. The problems you hear about are real, but the great things happening are real too. If you want to check out a great TED Talk, I like the Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. If you just focus on, you know, what you heard about poverty in Native communities, you'll have a really distorted view. If you just focus on something you heard about all Indians are rich from casinos, you'll also get a really distorted view. And you won't be able to reconcile those two really divergent ways of thinking. But in this community, my youngest brother's a medical doctor. We consider him the loser. My sister's now a judge. My other brother and I both have PhDs and published a bunch of books. And we're doing okay. And the kids are doing okay. And everyone wanted to ask her, like, how the heck did you do that in a place that seemed to bring other people down? And she said, I have no idea. But I do know that I value education. But by that, I don't mean education simply from books. I made sure that my kids learned how to harvest wild rice and fish and hunt, and that they got a first kill feast and things like that. And it made all the difference in the world, because nothing can stop an Indian who knows who he or she is. And to me, I think that's a big part of my calling with my kids, is to develop that in them. And with the really great theme that Chicago Public has come up with, looking at all of our shared and distinctive human experiences, whether you're a recent immigrant, you know, a fifth generation descendant of somebody who immigrated, or an indigenous person, it is in keeping those cultures and languages alive that we will keep alive that connection and fire within each of us. and that we can learn from one another, frankly, all of the problems created by the colonial way of solving problems will not be solved by the colonial way of solving problems, AKA violence. We are going to have to find some other ways, and we should be pollinating one another's gardens and working hard to preserve these different and distinctive ways of looking at the world. And we have a great deal to learn from one another. Go ahead and flip the slide one last time. Yeah, and maybe one more. There's my mom. There's contact information for me, so you can keep in touch by email or on the website. Lots of free resources there. And I really look forward to taking a few of your questions here with our remaining time, and staying in touch with you as things go forward. Thanks for all you do. Miigwech.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great. I have to tell you before we go into questions that something very strange has just happened in the chat that I've never experienced before, which is we have people asking questions in 3 different languages.
Yeah.
So I think that perhaps shows your audience is really getting the message.
Yeah, that's why they pay you the big bucks, Jennifer. You're going to figure them out.
I'm like, I'm not sure I know how to interpret all of these, but that's really cool. So, and thanks to the folks who asked the questions. We got a couple of questions, so I'll just run through a few of them. How do you balance Americans becoming more and more multicultural through intermarriage and other things with keeping your language spoken in a multicultural family?
Yeah, I think, both things have great value. To me, even looking at what's going on in our political universe, like democracy is a new way of structuring societies in the history of the world. It's really quite recent. We've only been at it, for some hundreds of years. And we are now finally testing democracy. I mean, Plato himself said it really works when you have a society of about 25,000 people. He actually gave us a number, right? And we have big, complex societies. But the real test of it will not be whether we can smash everybody up and assimilate them all into one language, culture, and worldview, but if we can actually not just tolerate, but really support all kinds of linguistic and cultural diversity. To me, that is a big test for democracy, and we haven't always succeeded at it. At the same time, of course, we are increasingly interconnected, interwoven, intermarried, and so forth. Like, it won't even be like Star Trek Next Generation, where we pretend that we're colorblind and everybody gets along and it's really great. It'll probably be like some kind of brown soup, by the time we get to that point, which seems like it's quite a ways off yet. But both of those things are, we need to keep on the radar screen. We should learn from one another. We should celebrate one another's interconnections, the oneness of all of us. And at the same time, we should be able to hold up and support one another's distinct differences. And I really believe that, we need some different ways for solving problems. And a lot of those are embedded in these different ways of thinking.
That's great. How would you like to see immigrants and Americans celebrate Native American people and culture?
Yeah, if I moved to Germany, I would find myself rude if I didn't learn a little German and learn something about the history of the little hamlet in Germany that I moved to. And welcome to this indigenous space. All of the land is indigenous land. And there is a human history here, and it didn't start with the arrival of the first white explorer. There are whole civilizations here. The Americas were at least as densely populated as Europe at the time of contact. The capital city of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan, was 3 times larger than the largest city in all of Europe at the time of contact. Not scattered bands of roaming nomads in the wilderness, right? And so learn about the long human history here and hold that up. And for America, to me, you look at like what happened with Germany after the Nazi Holocaust, and they had to mandate instruction about that in the school system, and there's still resistance and discomfort around it. How could the most well-educated, most literate society in the world come up with the final solution? I mean, it's a great question, and it's really hard to provide a great answer. But we have to learn from that. And I think one of the things that has kind of clouded this kind of learning and sharing and leaning into one another's stories in America is that the talk around American exceptionalism is so deep and profound. And no human being wants to be judged by their darkest day. No nation wants to be judged by its darkest day. But the simple fact of the matter is, when the first boatload of pilgrims arrived, there actually wasn't room for them. They made room by pushing other people out of the way and stealing their food and stealing their land. But that doesn't jive with that narrative of American exceptionalism. And America was built through genocidal treatment of indigenous people and through a Holocaust in trafficking of human slaves from Africa, right? And these things are morally repugnant, and they are at the center of American genesis and still the legacy that we are dealing with today. So we have to be able to take an honest look at that. And to me, I think it is because I love America so much that we must take an honest look at that, because we can improve her. And we can build upon not just the positive things that are part of that experience, but the negative things too. And we have to be able to look at it. So part of that means acknowledging, and like it was great to see the land acknowledgement, at the start of this event and so forth. That's an important first step. It's just not the end of that journey. And there's some really great efforts. I thought, I don't know how many of you travel around. Like I was up in Winnipeg. They actually have the National Canadian Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg, which seems a little weird. It's not in Toronto or Ottawa or something, but also cool that they did it that way. And it was such a cool museum. It's just 4 stories. And the first one, I think everyone could see themselves reflected in the stories there. Like, I didn't know that there was a persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in Canada, but there was. And there was a story there. There was a story about, treatment of Indigenous people in residential boarding schools. There was a story about internment of Japanese Canadians. I thought it was just the Americans who did that. No idea, And so by the time you go around, everyone kind of sees themselves reflected in one of the stories at least. And you go to the second floor and it kind of talks about genocide as a human practice. There's a lot on the Nazi Holocaust and stuff like that. And then on the third floor, it's like human beings who have been interrupting our dehumanizing human treatment of one another. And so you got stories about Gandhi and Mandela and things like that. And on the fourth floor, it's all about the visitor. How are you going to be the change? Do you have a story that is not reflected here? Tell it right now and it'll become part of the national record. And there's all kinds of ways to get engaged and involved. And I thought, what a cool transportation where it's not like we're just looking at the ugly chapters and bogged down dwelling there. We're reading the ugly chapters, the previous chapters, so we can write a new, better, happier, more positive chapter for the future. And we can't be disconnected from history. We have to learn from it. So that's my perspective about the broader effort. High time for some truth and reconciliation work here too.
That's great. I love this next question. What Native American writers, artists, or creators would you recommend? And before you answer that, I just want to plug for our audience that we have some reading recommendation lists on the website for Native American Heritage Month, which we also celebrate Native American heritage throughout the year too. So obviously check out this month's recommendations, but keep checking back for all other events going on throughout the year. So Anton, who are some of your favorites?
Oh man, there is so much work that has been going on, especially just the past 20 years, just kind of an explosion of Indigenous voices in all genres. So, the young reader world, fiction, nonfiction. For me, like some of the big names that everybody knows about, like a Louise Erdrich, for example, is still really powerful. I love some of her older stuff the best personally. Although she's cranking them out about as fast as I am, so it's a job keeping up with her. I just, I had an event with Tommy Orange, and I thought he was quite brilliant. His like each chapter is kind of like a standalone narrative, and at first I was like, how is this going to work? And all of a sudden, all the characters are like crashing into and colliding with one another. I thought it was a pretty innovative way to structure a piece of literature that had some really powerful things to say. There are just so many different voices out there, and it's really an exciting time. So more stuff coming every day.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Thanks to CPL's Native American Heritage Committee for all of their support and their help in making tonight's possible. Thank you to Dr. Anton Treuer, Professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University. I want to tell you about a few upcoming programs this month as part of our Native American Heritage Month celebrations. On Tuesday, November 17th at 6 p.m., Water is Life, Why We Need to Protect Our Fresh Water. So you won't want to miss that one. And then on Tuesday, November 24th at 4 p.m., Comanches Representing Comanches in Film, a discussion with Dr. Dustin Tamakara, and that's going to be a great program as well. I also will remind you that the One Book, One Chicago program is continuing through the end of the year, so do tune in for our future programs. We have many different things. I'll mention just a few coming up. This Friday is the next installment of Snacks in the Stacks, our Cooking Through Culture and Exploring Culture program. That's going to be Friday, November 13th at noon. Thursday, November 19th at 4 p.m., City Bureau presents The Future of Borders and a discussion on how immigration advocates are working, and that'll be an interactive workshop for you to participate as well. And then, of course, on Thursday, December 3rd at 7 p.m., it's our season finale with Mohsen Hamid, the author of Exit West. Thank you so much for everyone for being here. We've had a wonderful night. If you had friends who missed it, tell them they can watch this on demand on YouTube and on Facebook as soon as this program's over. See you next time.